A security guard twisted a black CEO's hand during a confrontation. He had no idea the man he was provoking could end his entire career with a single call. He thought breaking a man's fingers would break his will. He didn't realize the man he mocked could rebuild strength from pain itself. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always underestimates resilience. The line at the VIP checkpoint remained still, the silence broken only by the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint click of polished shoes on tile. Ezra Dane stood in front of the inspection station, his left hand casually resting on the handle of a sleek, black carry-on. His right hand, splinted, swollen, and still healing from a recent climbing accident, remained slightly bent at the wrist, protected by a tailored brace. He said nothing. His stillness wasn't passive. It was deliberate. Across from him stood Conrad Vale, the on-duty security officer assigned to screen high-level travelers. Stocky in build and sharp in tone, Conrad was known among his peers for enforcing protocol with unnecessary intensity. His face, flushed from whatever annoyance had greeted his morning, now hardened with something more personal, irritation slowly fermenting into contempt. "Sir, I'm going to need you to remove the ring," Conrad said, his voice low but pointed, as though he were issuing a challenge rather than a request. Ezra didn't flinch. "I can't," he replied, voice calm, tone even. "It's encrypted. If removed forcefully, it locks permanently. It's classified tech." Conrad narrowed his eyes. "You're saying it's dangerous?" "I'm saying it's sensitive," Ezra answered. He didn't raise his voice, but the words held the weight of someone who'd been down this road before. "Any attempt to remove it could compromise security, yours and mine." The moment lingered in the air like a held breath. Around them, a few other officers turned to glance in their direction. A businessman waiting behind Ezra subtly shifted backward, putting space between himself and the growing tension. No one spoke, but everyone could feel it. This wasn't going to end in routine. Conrad stepped forward, his boots heavy against the floor. "And who exactly do you work for?" Ezra met his eyes. "Argentum Systems." The name landed with no recognition. Conrad's lips curled, unimpressed. "Never heard of it." "You're not supposed to," Ezra said quietly. That was the moment something changed in Conrad's stance. He leaned slightly in, shoulders squared, as if absorbing an insult that had never been delivered. Ezra's calm confidence, the absence of fear, the measured tone, it all read to Conrad like defiance. "I see," Conrad muttered, dragging the silence between them into something sour. "One of those types." Ezra arched a brow, saying nothing. He'd seen this performance before. Men who mistook restraint for weakness. Men who, armed with just enough power to feel dangerous but not enough to be held accountable, searched for targets to validate their authority. Conrad wasn't here to follow protocol anymore. He was here to prove something. "What's with the hand?" Conrad gestured toward the brace. "Convenient injury," Ezra responded evenly. "Rock climbing, hairline fracture. 2 more weeks in a splint. Must be hard to comply with inspections when you're so delicate," Conrad sneered, stepping closer. He smelled faintly of aftershave and cheap coffee, breath hot with the stale remnants of control slipping away. Ezra's posture remained composed, but internally his instincts began to sharpen. Something was off, not just with the man, but with the setup. Too much pressure over too little detail. Too much aggression over a routine scan. And the ring. It had triggered something more than curiosity. "I'm following every command you've given me," Ezra said plainly. "Scan the bag. Review the ID. You've got my profile clearance. There's no cause for escalation." "But see," Conrad murmured, voice dropping to a whisper only Ezra could hear. "You look calm." "And I don't like that. Calm types, those are the ones who need to be reminded that rules still apply." Ezra's gaze didn't shift. "So, apply them." Conrad's smirk deepened. Then came the lean-in. A slow, deliberate invasion of space. He spoke through his teeth, the words meant to provoke, not instruct. Let's see how calm you stay when you can't move your fingers. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to contract. Ezra's pulse didn't rise, but something inside him clicked into place. A long, dormant reflex, half survival, half calculation, rose to the surface. It wasn't fear. It was readiness. A line had just been crossed. He tilted his head slightly, locking eyes with Conrad. Behind him, the scanner beeped once, the sound ignored. To his right, a junior officer, a lanky man in a worn uniform, looked over briefly, catching the tension but doing nothing. The moment froze in a frame of light and silence. Ezra could feel the chill of the air conditioner brushing against his neck, the weight of eyes beginning to focus, the slow draw of a fuse lighting beneath the surface. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't respond with threat or submission. Just one thought moved through him like a blade unsheathed. Even control has its breaking point. The moment Ezra extended his hand, the air in the security bay shifted. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the room's steel counters and scuffed tile floor. The silence wasn't empty. It was taut, vibrating with the unspoken warning of something about to snap. Conrad Vale, thick-necked and jittery with a need to dominate, grabbed Ezra's wrist with both hands, his grip cruel and deliberate. He didn't ask for compliance, he demanded submission. Without hesitation, he wrenched Ezra's fingers back, slow at first, watching for a flinch. When Ezra's face remained unreadable, Conrad twisted harder. Then came the sound, a sharp, sickening crack that echoed off the cold walls like the snap of a dry branch underfoot. Ezra's jaw tightened, his throat working through the pain, but he didn't cry out. His gaze stayed locked on Conrad's eyes, steady, unyielding, almost surgical in its focus. Conrad's smirk twisted wider as if he had found the limits of the man in front of him. "Let's see how many more stay straight," he muttered, voice low, almost gleeful. One by one he took each finger in turn, forefinger, ring, middle, pulling them back with mechanical precision, not like a guard conducting a check, but like a man trying to dismantle another piece by piece. The room's only other occupant, Officer Reeve, shifted uncomfortably. His posture betrayed unease, hands fidgeting near his belt. "Sir," he said quietly, trying to mask his concern, "that's enough." "Step back," Conrad snapped, his voice rising, cracking under the weight of his authority. His eyes didn't leave Ezra, as if testing how far he could go without consequences. Ezra didn't move. His breathing had slowed, deep and intentional, each inhale a calculated act of restraint. Beneath the surface, he catalogued every sensation, joint dislocation, ligament tear, blood flooding into the tendons. Pain was not new to him, nor was humiliation. But this moment wasn't about survival. It was about observation, mapping, anticipating. He saw more than just a man abusing power. He saw a system that allowed it. The stiffness in Reeves' shoulders, the camera dome blinking in the corner, the unauthorized terminal half hidden behind a steel column, all data points, all part of the equation now forming in Ezra's mind. Then, without a word, he lifted his uninjured hand. Calmly, slowly, every movement measured. His broken finger hung at a grotesque angle, the skin around the joint already bruising. He took it gently between his thumb and forefinger, and with a muted pop, he snapped it back into place. A sharp breath escaped from Reeve. Conrad flinched. Ezra didn't wince. Instead, he looked up, meeting their eyes with the kind of control that unsettles more than rage ever could. His voice was level, almost instructional, like a teacher correcting a mistake. "Pain teaches precision." The sentence hung in the air like frost, crystal clear and cold. Conrad blinked, his mouth twitching in confusion, unsure if he had just won or lost some invisible war. The smirk he had worn like armor faltered. For the first time, He wasn't looking at a target. He was looking at a threat. Something older, sharper, and far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Ezra's gaze was no longer simply human. It was engineered calm, a quiet weapon forged from decades of discipline, code, and consequence. He didn't need to raise his voice or flex his fists. He just needed to look. He saw the shift in Conrad's posture, the subtle pullback of the shoulders, the twitch in his dominant hand. Fear had entered the room, not as panic, but as doubt. And doubt, in men like Conrad, always meant retreat. From the corner of the room, the low whir of the air conditioning returned, the only sound to fill the silence. Reeve stood frozen, his earlier protest lingering in the stale air, unacknowledged but heard. He had seen it too, something in Ezra that didn't belong here. Not just a man with a splinted hand and tired eyes, but someone who had walked into this trap fully aware of its shape. Ezra reached for the edge of the metal bench and pulled himself upright, his posture controlled despite the throb running down his forearm. The damage was real, but it was no longer the center of the moment. The center was him. He stepped forward slightly, not threatening, not aggressive, but deliberate, as if to say, "I'm not broken." I'm aligned. Conrad took half a step back, uncertain now. His voice didn't come. His confidence had hollowed. Ezra leaned just enough for his words to carry. "You've just touched the wrong system," he murmured. The supervisor stepped into the inspection bay just as the tension thickened, his polished shoes clicking against the tile, eyes scanning the room for control he no longer possessed. Conrad Vale was already speaking before the man could ask a single question, his voice rising with urgency dressed in false authority. "He resisted inspection," Conrad said, gesturing to Ezra with a rehearsed flick of his hand. "He became aggressive when I asked him to remove a classified device. Then he tried to access one of the restricted systems behind my desk." Ezra didn't speak. He sat on the bench near the wall, his fractured hand cradled subtly against his side. A fine tremor coursed through his fingertips, but his posture remained composed. He watched Conrad weave the story, each word more careless than the last, and saw how the supervisor, a man too comfortable behind forms and protocol, nodded in blind alignment. Bureaucracies didn't want truth. They wanted ease. And right now, ease came with a file that said, "Non-compliant subject," and a staff report written by someone with a badge, no matter how crooked. The supervisor scribbled something onto a tablet and didn't look up. "If he's a system threat, isolate and flag him," he muttered. "Contact internal tech and initiate temporary freeze." Ezra closed his eyes briefly. Freeze. That meant they would attempt to lock his biometric data, possibly disable access to secure networks, even at the cost of damaging systems far beyond the terminal. He opened his eyes, not in panic, but calculation. Paramedics appeared beside him, two young men in navy blue jumpsuits, unsure whether they were there to help or observe. One of them reached toward Ezra's hand with gentle hesitation. "Sir, we need to—" "Not yet," Ezra said, his voice quiet but firm. The paramedic paused, confused. "There's clear trauma. You could lose mobility if—" "Not yet," Ezra repeated. His tone hadn't changed, but the firmness of it left no room for argument. The medics stepped back. Ezra turned his gaze upward, to the small black dome embedded in the corner of the ceiling. The hidden camera. It was standard in most inspection zones, but most forgot it was there. Ezra hadn't. It had recorded every second, every pull of his fingers, every word barked by Conrad, every lie spoken since. He had also noticed something else during the altercation, something that hadn't made sense until now. Just behind Conrad's inspection desk, partially shielded by a privacy panel, was a second interface, a data terminal, but this one wasn't connected to the main airport server. Ezra had seen the faint green LED blinking in a sequence he recognized, an unsecured channel, and behind that channel, a shadow server. Conrad shouldn't have had access to anything remotely resembling that level of interface. Guards like him operated on front-facing screens, badges, bags, basic scans. This system was deeper, more dangerous. Ezra felt the pain in his fingers grow sharper, anchoring him, not to the injury, but to clarity. He had dealt with security breaches before, cloaked in the language of protocol, masked beneath the convenience of policy. What was happening here wasn't random misconduct. It was an opening. Someone inside the terminal wanted access to something they couldn't obtain through legitimate means, and they had chosen the wrong man to corner. A whisper broke the pattern. "You should get out before this turns ugly," Officer Reeve murmured near the door, his voice low, tense. He didn't meet Ezra's eyes, but the hesitation in his shoulders betrayed conflict. Reeve had watched the abuse. He had done nothing, but now his conscience had fractured just enough to speak. Ezra stood slowly, controlling every movement, ignoring the flinch that rippled through his nerves. He looked at Reeve, expression unreadable, and replied without blinking. "It already has." Just not in the way they think. The door shut behind Ezra with a mechanical hiss, sealing the holding room in a quiet that felt far too deliberate. No security buzzers, no echo of hallway footsteps, just the hum of overhead fluorescents and the stale, recycled air pressing close. Two men were already waiting inside. Lorne sat nearest to the room's corner, his posture stiff, arms folded as though rehearsed for dominance. His badge gleamed, untouched by age or use, the kind worn by someone more concerned with appearances than protocol. Beside him was Vix, younger, leaner, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Both of them rose slowly when Ezra entered, as if expecting a different kind of man. Ezra didn't sit right away. He surveyed the room. 2 chairs bolted to the floor, 1 camera in the top corner, a wall-mounted screen dark but humming faintly, a monitor that was probably off to him, but live somewhere else. "Please," Lorne said, gesturing with a flat palm toward the metal chair. His voice was professional, but his tone gave away too much. It was the kind of calm a man used when he thought he had control. Ezra sat without comment. He placed his injured hand carefully in his lap, concealing the tremor that still vibrated along the tendons. Pain radiated in waves, but his expression was flat, neutral. "We just want to ask a few standard questions," Vix began, pulling a clipboard from beneath the table. "Of course," Ezra said evenly. "Routine inquiry." "I understand." Lorne leaned forward, elbows pressed against the table's edge. "Argentum Systems. That's your firm." Ezra nodded once. "Your encryption protocols," Vix continued, "specifically those used in multinodal defense contracts, are they domestically managed or outsourced?" Ezra let a beat pass. "That information's classified." "But you knew that before you asked." Lorne didn't smile. "Just clearing up some confusion." "Confusion implies something wasn't already known," Ezra said. The tension thickened. Then Vix said it, a phrase so specific, so buried in past operations that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. "Is your firm still implementing redundancies under the citrine protocol?" Ezra's eyes didn't move, but in his chest something clicked into place. Citrine protocol wasn't a public term. It referred to an internal containment framework once used by a joint task force to stop a data breach in Belarus, a mission Ezra had helped architect 6 years ago. The phrase hadn't been uttered since, not publicly, not even internally at Argentum. He kept his voice measured. "Strange question for airport security." "We handle high-value threats," Lorne said casually, as if his lie could float above the silence. Ezra leaned back slowly in the chair, his fingers resting on the edge of the metal table. The splint along his middle finger caught the light, still crooked from the earlier assault. He noted the glances both men gave it. Vix tried to mask his interest, but Lorne didn't bother. His eyes fixed on Ezra's ring, the one he hadn't removed, the one they hadn't stopped trying to get a closer look at. I see, Ezra said. This isn't about a security violation. This is a recovery attempt, Lorne stiffened. That's a dangerous accusation. It's not an accusation if it's already happening, Ezra replied calmly. It's just recognition. Silence returned, heavier now. When Vix leaned forward to reach for Ezra's hand, again, under the pretense of examination, Ezra didn't flinch. He simply leaned back, letting his arms fall away from the table. He said nothing. That pause, the refusal to participate, unnerved them more than any outburst would have. Vix sat back down, eyes darting toward Lorne. There it was again, that ripple of misalignment. They weren't improvising. They were working off a script. Ezra's mind ran backward through every detail since the checkpoint: Conrad's terminal, the unauthorized connection port, Reeves' hesitation. This wasn't just power abuse. It was coordinated. Conrad had never been working alone. These men were part of a deeper loop, one with access to phrases and systems only known by entities connected to intelligence infrastructure. Something foreign, something dangerous. Lorne stood. We'll need to hold your ring for forensic imaging. No, Ezra said plainly. Lorne's brow twitched. Refusal to comply. Would imply this is legal to begin with, Ezra interrupted. Neither man moved. Ezra looked at the camera, held it for 2 seconds, then turned back. I'll need to make a call. You're being held under standard observation, Lorne said. No calls. I wasn't asking, Ezra replied. Lorne hesitated. Vix shifted in his seat. They gave him the call. The line was routed through a monitoring terminal just down the hallway. Ezra knew it. The moment the call connected, it would be recorded, tagged, and analyzed. But he wasn't trying to hide what he was about to say. Jalen answered within 2 rings. Jalen. Protocol Gray. Key compromise silence on the other end. Not even a breath. Then a quiet response. Understood. Ezra ended the call and placed the receiver gently back in its cradle. Somewhere across the city, deep within Argentum's secure data vaults, biometric subroutines activated silently. Fail-safes, backdoors, AI monitoring nodes, everything triggered in sequence, like gears locking into place. Behind him, the monitor on the wall blinked once. Neither Lorne nor Vix noticed. Ezra rose, looking at them both with an almost clinical detachment. You're looking for access to something you don't understand. Vix narrowed his eyes. We'll decide that. No, Ezra said, walking to the door, pausing just before the threshold. You decided when you let Conrad touch the ring. He opened the door, then stopped. They thought they broke a man, Ezra thought, his steps slow but unwavering. But they just triggered a system. Conrad Vale's access card beeped red. Again. He tapped it twice more against the terminal reader, jamming the edge hard enough to leave a dent. But the red light didn't change. The screen above flickered once, then went black. Behind him, the air buzzed with static confusion. Screens throughout the terminal's security grid glitched into strings of encrypted code. Surveillance cameras rotated in unison, then froze mid-turn. Conrad turned sharply toward the other guards in the bay, forcing authority into his voice even as it trembled. Reboot the system. Now, but no one moved. Ezra Dane watched from a bench nearby, his injured hand resting in his lap, fingers gently adjusting the brace. A fine sheen of sweat clung to his brow, though his expression was carved in stone. He said nothing, but his eyes tracked every flickering monitor, every frozen frame, every nervous glance between officers. The silence was no longer the pause before chaos. It was the sound of control being redirected. From the moment Conrad had twisted his hand, Ezra had triggered a hidden failsafe in his biometric ring. It wasn't a retaliatory trap, it was a protocol embedded into Argentum's private AI, a silent defense tethered to Ezra's vital signs and location. The moment the system registered the forced stress spike, it activated. And now, quietly and invisibly, It was reclaiming control. A soft shuffling broke the moment. Officer Reeve hesitated near the corner, his eyes darting between Conrad and Ezra. His steps were uncertain, guilt heavy in each one. He approached Ezra without a word and slipped a folded sheet of paper into his good hand before walking away again like nothing had happened. Ezra unfolded it slowly. His eyes scanned the system log. It wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. There it was, Varen Analytics. A shadow entity flagged by Argentum's internal threat database months ago, now exposed through a buried remote access signature. The trail led directly to Lorne's login credentials. Ezra folded the paper again with the same care a surgeon might use to close a wound. Then, slowly, he stood. "The thief isn't outside your system," Ezra said, his voice quiet but cutting through the room like a scalpel. "He's in your staff directory." Every officer in the room froze. Lorne, who had entered seconds earlier, stiffened as if someone had cracked an invisible whip across his back. His gaze fell on the folded paper in Ezra's hand, then on the monitors, which now displayed cascading command strings marked with Argentum's encryption signature. His fingers twitched toward his radio, but he knew. It was already too late. Outside the bay, the mainframe routers hummed erratically. Terminal-wide, Federal alert beacons were blinking, triggered not by human hands but by AI-level forensic tracing. Argentum's AI had followed the attempted data siphon upstream, through every hidden port, every buried protocol, and sent a direct alert to Federal cybersecurity auditors. A ping that couldn't be deleted, a mirror that couldn't be turned away from. Suddenly, Conrad snapped. "You set us up!" he shouted, his boots slamming against the floor as he lunged toward Ezra again. The other officers reached for their sidearms, too slow, but Ezra didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his stance unshaken despite the brace and swelling on his hand. Blood still dried in dark flakes along the edge of his knuckles. His shoulders squared as if they carried nothing at all. "You set yourself up," Ezra said calmly, his tone absolute, a final nail driven without malice. "I just corrected the imbalance." The room stood still. Lorne's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced toward the terminal where his own credentials now blazed like a confession. An officer to his left reached for his radio, but the signal jammed. Every console had already been locked. The doors weren't the only things shutting. So were the lies. Ezra's eyes didn't wander. He stood in stillness, not out of pride, but clarity. Control didn't need volume. It needed certainty. Behind him, a distant siren echoed as the internal grid restructured itself. It wasn't a crash. It was a correction, a purge, a reckoning. Correction always looks like rebellion to those who built the error. The command bay fell into an unnatural silence, broken only by the distant hum of emergency power kicking in. Lorne's voice had barely stopped echoing. "Shut down all exits," when the system lights flickered once, then again, before plunging the control panels into a dim, red haze. It was as if the entire terminal exhaled and forgot how to breathe. Monitors blinked erratically. Keypads went dead beneath frantic fingers. Doors locked in unison with mechanical thuds like synchronized drums. What should have been a response to chaos had become a full containment. Ezra didn't flinch. He stood in place, his gaze fixed on Lorne like a surgeon tracking a heartbeat monitor before an incision. Around them, confusion spread like fire through dry grass. Some officers looked to Lorne, others to each other. The chain of command had splintered, and in that fracture, uncertainty bloomed. The air was heavy with the unsaid truth that no one really knew who was in control anymore. Across the room, Officer Conrad Vale's hand hovered near his belt, unsure whether to reach for a weapon or a door handle. Sweat pooled at the edges of his temples, trailing past the scar beneath his ear, a detail Ezra's sharp eyes didn't miss. It was the face of a man who had lost the script. Ezra's own hand, still swollen from the earlier assault, remained loosely at his side. The pain was constant, but controlled, converted into clarity with every pulse. Lorne barked into his radio again. "Security command. Override the firewall. We're losing access to—" He paused, staring at the screen now feeding back lines of text at blinding speed. The Argentum system's encryption watermark blinked across each line, stamped like a seal of ownership. "What is this?" he muttered. Ezra took a single step forward. "It's called Blackline Containment," he said, his voice low and even. "Fail-safe protocol, tied to biometric authentication." Lorne spun toward him, a mix of disbelief and fury rising in his eyes. "You triggered this." Ezra tilted his head slightly, the ghost of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "No. The system triggered itself. It recognized my distress signal the moment your man pulled my hand apart." At that, one of the younger officers near the entrance, Officer Brennan, visibly recoiled. He looked at Lorne, then at Conrad, whose expression was now twitching between anger and regret. The surveillance cameras above the bay turned slowly of their own accord, reactivating. A moment later, their lens lights glowed faint blue. They weren't recording for airport archives anymore. They were live streaming to an external federal server. Ezra's words sliced through the tension like a blade. "You wanted the key," he said, turning to Lorne. "You just opened the vault." Lorne froze. His hands trembled as he faced the largest monitor in the bay. On-screen, mirrored files began to open. They weren't just security logs, they were transactional records, internal memos, IP handshakes. Every digital footprint that Varen Analytics had tried to erase was now reappearing, time-stamped and archived. Some lines were flagged in red. Those were high-level access breaches routed through international proxies. "You don't understand what you're doing," Lorne said, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. This data isn't for public eyes." Ezra's face remained still. "It never was." "That's the problem." A harsh series of beeps interrupted the moment. The security grid's override panel locked itself with a hiss of escaping air. Argentum's containment sequence had reached its final phase. External agencies were being notified through encrypted emergency protocols, bypassing local command. Lorne gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "Shut it down. Disconnect everything." "You can't," Ezra said, stepping beside him now. "That's the point of a true failsafe. It doesn't ask for permission. It only waits for a threat." Outside the bay, the main concourse lights flickered. Boarding signs froze mid-cycle. Terminal announcements ceased. Passengers across Haverson International were unaware that their safety systems had just been hijacked. Not by a hacker, but by a founder whose firm had once been tasked with preventing the very thing now unfolding. Ezra's thoughts moved fast beneath the calm surface. He recalled every security angle he had studied on the way in, every blind spot, every delay in Conrad's movements. They had left digital fingerprints everywhere, faint but traceable, and now every one of those marks was illuminating in sequence, like a constellation forming overhead. Behind them, Conrad finally found his voice. "You think you're going to get away with this?" Ezra turned slowly. "Get away?" He stepped forward until they were face to face. "You already did. For years. But today, your script ran into a different protocol." Conrad's eyes narrowed. "You set us up." "No," Ezra said, his voice steady, not rising. "You set yourself up. I just corrected the imbalance." The motion was sloppy, wild, more fear than strategy, but it came fast. His right arm cut through the air, aiming to shove Ezra back or worse. But Ezra was faster. In one fluid motion, he pivoted his weight, caught Conrad's wrist mid-strike, and twisted. The sudden shift in direction sent the guard stumbling forward, off balance. Ezra's body moved like a machine fine-tuned under pressure, each muscle responding not with fury, but precision. His broken fingers, still bruised and swollen, flexed with an eerie control as they locked around Conrad's arm. There was no warning, no growl, no shout. Ezra spun the larger man around and slammed him against the security bay wall. The metal panel let out a deep, hollow clang that echoed through the room like a gavel striking finality. The commotion halted instantly. Conversations stopped. Radios went silent. The other officers froze. Reeves' hand hovered halfway toward his holster but didn't move. Lorne, standing near the main console, stared, jaw slack. Ezra pressed Conrad hard into the wall, his hand gripping the man's collarbone just below the throat. Not choking, just holding. His grip was tight enough to command stillness, yet controlled enough not to bruise. The power wasn't in the violence, it was in the calm. "You wanted to break me," Ezra said, his voice low, smooth, measured. His breath didn't even tremble. Blood dripped slowly from his nose, a thin red thread painting his upper lip and collecting at his chin. He didn't wipe it. He didn't blink. With his free hand, he reached up, gently placed his thumb against the bridge of his nose, and gave a small, deliberate push. There was a soft, wet pop as the cartilage realigned. A few onlookers winced. One officer turned away. But Ezra's expression remained untouched by the pain. He exhaled once, as though calibrating a machine. Then he straightened his jacket with deliberate care, smoothing the crease over his ribs. "Now," he continued, stepping back from Conrad without haste, "we finish this the civilized way." Conrad sagged slightly against the wall, stunned, his eyes wide with something between humiliation and disbelief. His hands twitched as if searching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing left, no badge, no control, no certainty. Ezra turned toward the security corridor and motioned with a small gesture of his hand. "You'll walk me to your data terminal. Every step will be recorded." There was no threat in his tone, no anger, only inevitability. The calm in his voice didn't invite argument, it eliminated it. Conrad didn't move at first. He looked at the other officers as if silently pleading for intervention, but no one stepped forward. The authority in the room had shifted, and they all felt it. Ezra waited, his gaze steady. Conrad finally nodded, a small mechanical motion, then began walking toward the corridor door, his posture hunched and uncertain. Each footstep echoed against the polished tile floor like reluctant admissions. The security bay's lights flickered faintly above them, casting long shadows behind the group. As they passed the locked-down terminals and blinking monitors, the hum of emergency power pulsed low in the background like a warning. The air was heavier now, tighter. Every officer knew something irreversible had begun, but they couldn't name it yet. Reeve fell into step behind them, silent. His face betrayed a mix of fear and respect, as though unsure if Ezra was a man or something more deliberate, something designed for moments just like this. They reached the glass door that led to the terminal access room. Conrad reached to swipe his ID card, but the scanner didn't respond. A red light pulsed once, then again. The system had already revoked his authority. He stepped back, glancing at Ezra. Ezra reached forward with his own hand, the one Conrad had nearly crushed earlier, and pressed a tiny button on the side of his ring. The door slid open instantly. Behind it, rows of data consoles blinked silently. As Conrad stepped through first, Ezra paused for half a breath and turned back to the others. His tone was still soft, still unshaken. "When someone weaponizes obedience," he said, "the only rebellion is calm." He yanked the CEO's fingers back one by one until the snap echoed through the terminal, unaware the man he tortured held power beyond comprehension. If you believe silence in the face of abuse is complicity, hit subscribe now. Justice doesn't shout, it strikes back. They reached the data terminal under thick silence, their footsteps echoing along the narrow corridor. Emergency lights pulsed overhead, throwing shadows across the gray concrete walls. Reeve led the group with cautious urgency, his grip tight on the baton holstered at his side. Beside him, two younger officers followed, visibly nervous, shifting glances between Ezra and Conrad, unsure who they were really guarding. Their badges reflected a faint red glow from the backup power grid, which had overridden the standard interface systems just minutes earlier. Behind them, Lorne clutched his now silent radio like it still held authority, his eyes darting from screen to screen. Each monitor they passed displayed cascading lines of encrypted code, and at the bottom corner, Argentum's digital watermark pulsed like a heartbeat. Ezra walked with calm determination, the brace on his hand visible but his posture unbroken. He didn't need force, he had leverage, and every second they wasted gave his team more time to sweep deeper into Varen's illicit architecture. As they arrived at the workstation, a small enclosed terminal room tucked behind a frosted glass panel, he turned to Conrad and motioned toward the chair. "Sit," Ezra said, his voice sharp and clinical. Conrad hesitated, the skin around his eyes tight with confusion and fear. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by a twitchy uncertainty that made even the young officers shift away from him. With a reluctant breath, Conrad obeyed, lowering himself into the metal chair as though it might collapse under the weight of his guilt. Ezra stepped forward. The terminal blinked alive with his touch, its biometric lock recognizing the ring on his hand despite the damage to his fingers. He typed quickly, not looking at the keyboard, his gaze locked on the unfolding code that danced across the screen. Within seconds, mirrored data began populating the monitor: internal logs, financial transfers, usernames, access authorizations, and, at the top of it all, a name pulsed in red: Lorne H. Vicks. "You access this system under false authority," Ezra said without looking at Conrad, his tone stripped of emotion. "Using my identity as a gateway." The words settled into the room like smoke. Reeve stepped back instinctively. One of the younger officers muttered under his breath, "Oh no." Ezra continued typing. The screen split, revealing transaction histories, long trails of diverted defense contracts routed through dummy accounts, black market sales disguised as consulting fees, private communications stamped with Varen's confidential seal. "You weren't stealing from me," Ezra said, turning his eyes now toward Lorne, who stood rigid by the doorway. "You were stealing from your own government." Lorne's face went pale. He lunged forward suddenly, pushing past Reeve in a wild attempt to shut down the terminal, but Reeve reacted fast. With a practiced movement, he locked his arm around Lorne's and pulled him back, forcing him against the wall. Lorne struggled, breath ragged, veins showing in his neck. "Let go," Lorne snapped, panic creeping into his voice. "You don't know what this is." "I do," Ezra interrupted, stepping between them. His eyes, steady and unreadable, locked onto Lorne's. "I knew the moment I heard you say, Citrine Protocol." The silence in the room grew heavier. Even the hum of emergency power seemed to dim. Ezra turned the screen toward the officers. "This system," he said, "was compromised to funnel predictive defense algorithms into private hands. That server Conrad accessed, it wasn't for customs. It was an access point to Varen's trading node, piggybacking on federal bandwidth Lorne's legs gave slightly, but Reeve tightened his hold. Ezra turned back to the screen and entered a final string of code. A new window appeared, video footage of the inspection bay, including the moment Conrad twisted Ezra's fingers. The image was silent, but the violence was unmistakable. Overlaid on the footage were time-stamped logs proving the exact second that unauthorized data was pulled. "I built the architecture," Ezra said, his voice low. "The one you thought you could reverse engineer. You believed I was just a man with clearance. A consultant. Maybe a quiet executive passing through." He stepped closer to the terminal, tapped one final command and locked the evidence behind Argentum's digital seal. A confirmation ping echoed. "I'm the one who built the algorithm you tried to sell." Conrad swallowed hard, staring at the screen like it was a noose tightening around his neck. His breathing grew shallow, each inhale shorter than the last. "Who are you?" he asked, voice barely audible. Ezra held his gaze. No triumph in his eyes, no fury, just truth, sharp and deliberate. "The person your employers hoped didn't exist." Behind them, the fluorescent lights flickered once as though the entire building held its breath. News of the incident erupted like wildfire. The moment Ezra's hand was twisted and reset on camera, the footage found its way beyond the walls of Haverson International. First, through a silent notification to a journalist embedded in an independent tech watchdog, then through an anonymous tip that linked the name Varon Analytics to a growing web of illicit data exchanges. Within hours, reporters were gathering like storm clouds at the terminal entrance. Satellite vans lined the curb. Microphones waited. Their feeds played the same loops on every screen. Ezra Dane, wounded but composed, facing down a man twice his weight and snapping his own finger back into place with clinical calm. It wasn't brutality that shocked the public. It was Ezra's refusal to return it. Inside the terminal, the air grew heavier with consequence. A federal oversight unit arrived in unmarked vans, stepping into the hall like a quiet avalanche. Their jackets bore no insignias, but their presence demanded silence. Without ceremony, they walked past trembling staff and shut down Varon's local server rack with a single override key. The blue diagnostic lights blinked once, then blacked out. Lorne and Vix were apprehended without protest. Their badge access had already been revoked, their consoles wiped clean by Argentum's shadow protocol hours earlier. Vix looked stunned, still mouthing silent questions no one would answer. Lorne, however, looked betrayed, not by Ezra, but by the machine that had obeyed another master. Conrad sat slumped on a plastic bench in the security corridor, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his palms. His shoulders shook, not from sobbing, but from the collapse of a certainty he once wore like armor. The fingers he'd broken were not what undid him. It was the slow horror that unfolded as monitors revealed what Ezra had triggered, what his arrogance had cost. Around him, the terminal swirled with activity, but Conrad sat still, no longer part of the movement. The cruelty he'd delivered with smirking pride now echoed back at him from every screen and every whisper. Just beyond the central security checkpoint, Officer Reeve watched the chaos unfold, his jaw clenched, heart heavy. He had tried, once, to stop the pain. But one whisper wasn't enough. Guilt tightened around his ribs as he filled out the resignation form with a trembling pen. He signed his name, folded the paper twice, and slipped it quietly onto his supervisor's desk. No statement, no press, just absence. By the time the cameras came, Reeve was already gone. Meanwhile, in the terminal's crisis management suite, Ezra sat surrounded by a circle of government officials and federal inspectors. The room was dim but alive with tension. Screens displayed flowcharts of the breach, files tagged with federal seals, and a digital copy of Ezra's biometric ring protocols. His injured hand remained unbandaged, the bruises forming shadows against his skin. Yet his posture was upright, voice even, as if the wound belonged to someone else. They weren't just accessing a private system, he explained. They were mapping patterns, pulling predictive data, and funneling it to unauthorized mirrors. Most of those buyers weren't local A-man in a Navy suit leaned forward. Why would a guard at a terminal have that kind of access? Ezra didn't blink, because someone above him needed a cleaner path. And Conrad Vale was too proud to ask why he was chosen. The officials exchanged looks. Some scribbled notes, others folded their arms in disbelief, but none interrupted. Another man, graying at the temples, asked, "Mr. Dane, how did you remain composed after such a violent confrontation?" Ezra paused, then answered with the same clarity he had used in boardrooms and congressional testimonies. "You can't protect anything by losing control of yourself." The words lingered in the air, cutting through the bureaucratic noise like a scalpel. No one challenged him. Outside the suite, the press roared, but inside, a deeper shift was taking place. Not just accountability, but blueprint. Ezra was no longer a witness. He had become an architect of correction, of exposure, of how resilience could be engineered. Behind his calm voice was a man who had been tested, not broken. And now he outlined the process not for retribution, but for structural rebirth. As he exited the room under discreet escort, the long corridor to the private terminal exit felt colder than when he'd arrived. The lights overhead hummed low, almost apologetic. Beyond the glass doors, snow had begun to fall, soft against the pavement. Ezra adjusted the cuff of his jacket with his uninjured hand. No limping, no grimace, just forward movement. A reporter shouted something behind the barricades, but he didn't stop. His eyes were focused ahead, fixed not on the damage done, but on the systems yet to be rebuilt. The air outside felt colder, heavier, but he walked with measured certainty, carrying not anger, but intention. The footage hit the global networks like a fault line breaking open. First came the clip, just 38 seconds long. No edits, no commentary. Ezra Dane, his face calm, hand mangled, snapping his own finger back into place with chilling precision before walking straight toward the man who had assaulted him. No yelling, no fists, no chaos, just calculated silence. The internet didn't need music or filters to make it powerful. Millions watched it on repeat. A silent act of pain, reclaimed without retaliation. It became a symbol before Ezra even knew it had aired. Inside his office at Argentum Systems, the room was dark but for the soft glow of multiple monitors. Ezra stood by the tall window, his gaze resting on the city's jagged skyline. His left hand flexed slowly, still stiff at the knuckles but nearly healed. On the table behind him, a dozen interview requests blinked on the screen. CNN, Voxus Media, Global Insight, even the Ministry of Security Ethics. He declined them all without opening. "Jalen," he said quietly. His assistant entered, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. "Another 5 requests," he muttered, handing Ezra a tablet. "One of them's offering a documentary slot. Lifetime rights, Ezra didn't look at it." "Has the Vector Accords draft gone out?" "This morning, all 87 pages. The redacted section on Varen's ghost contracts is the highlight. They'll eat it up." Ezra nodded, turning back to the glass. "Then we let the report speak." He had formed the Vector Accord with one goal: to expose institutional vulnerabilities where power had gone unchecked. Within weeks, the task force had quietly mapped Varen Analytics' internal ecosystem, an invisible web of corrupted terminals, forged access points, and silent approvals hidden in plain sight. What had started at Haverson Terminal turned out to be just one node in a much larger network, stretching into municipal defense agencies and third-party tech contractors. The program's first release landed hard. Within 24 hours, it triggered a multi-jurisdictional raid on Varen's upper management. The founder, Nicholas Wren, was taken into custody. Internal logs revealed conversations referencing Ezra by name, specifically targeting his biometric ring, believing it could open a backdoor to Argentum's quantum encryption library. That assumption had cost them everything. In the quiet aftermath, a letter arrived. Jalen entered the office again, holding a cream envelope. "This just came in." Hand-delivered by a legal courier, Ezra took it carefully. The handwriting on the front was sharp but strained. He opened it and scanned the contents in silence. A few lines. No excuses. Just one sentence that mattered. "What I did was not just cruelty. It was ignorance." It was signed, Conrad Vale. Ezra folded the letter with a practiced gentleness and slipped it into the bottom drawer of his desk. He didn't lock it. He didn't reread it. Some things didn't need closure, they needed containment. His hand was healing. The bruises had faded, but the scars beneath were more valuable now. Each knuckle carried a lesson, not of pain, but of precision. A reminder that control, once tested and kept, became something stronger than force. As the sun began to dip behind the towers, the office filled with amber light. Jalen hesitated before speaking again. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd lost control that day?" Ezra turned slowly, the lines on his face catching the fading light. He looked at Jalen, then beyond him, at the skyline, the noise of the world rising just beneath the glass. His voice was steady, almost quiet enough to be lost in the hum of the city. "Then they'd remember my anger, not the truth," he said, "and truth should always make the louder sound. Some men fight with rage. Others fight by staying silent long enough to change the world." The room was silent when Ezra Dane took his seat before the congressional panel. The chamber, packed with lawmakers, journalists, and legal observers, echoed only with the clicking of pens and the occasional shuffle of papers. Cameras blinked silently in the corners. On the monitor beside him, frozen footage from the terminal showed Conrad Vale twisting Ezra's hand, the bone visibly misaligned. A still image of that moment remained on screen for the duration of his testimony. But Ezra never once looked at it. He sat upright, left hand resting in his lap, right hand, once shattered, lightly curled around the edge of the desk. The congressional inquiry into Varen Analytics had reached its peak, and Ezra's testimony was the final session of the day. The air was tense with expectation. Some expected him to seek vengeance, others expected a breakdown. Neither came. "What is your full name and role for the record?" the lead investigator asked, his voice filtered through a worn microphone. "Ezra Dane." "Founder and CEO of Argentum Systems," he replied, calm, crisp. The panel began with formal questions, confirming dates, timelines, chain of command failures. But as the hours unfolded, the tone shifted. Ezra's answers were steady, clear, and layered with quiet authority. He named names without aggression, described systems without embellishment, and traced lines of corruption with surgical precision. "When did you first suspect that Varen Analytics was involved in unauthorized surveillance?" asked Senator Mickelson, an older man with a notepad full of underlined phrases. Ezra tilted his head slightly. "When a guard with no clearance tried to access a classified biometric key using a protocol last seen in a shuttered Coldstone directive. That protocol was only shared with subcontractors linked to Varen's defense portfolios," gasps murmured through the back rows. "And what did you do?" another senator pressed. "I didn't resist," I observed. "I recorded," Ezra answered. "You don't dismantle a system from the outside by shouting. You collapse it from within by showing it the truth," he continued, unveiling a pattern of falsified access requests, rogue terminals rerouted through shadow subsidiaries, and data laundering pipelines that looped through front companies registered offshore. The web was massive. At the center stood Lorne Vicks and several mid-level intelligence liaisons, all now under investigation. But Ezra never raised his voice. "When systems reward cruelty," he said to the panel, "you don't punish the cruel, you redesign the system." The words landed like a gavel. Several members of the committee paused their note-taking. Across the gallery, one of the federal oversight aides, young, sharp-suited, and visibly tense, lowered his pen slowly, his face unreadable. Then came the turning point. A different senator, younger and sharper in tone, leaned forward. "Mr. Dane, with all due respect, you were physically assaulted. You had every reason to retaliate. Why didn't you?" Ezra's eyes didn't blink. He held the senator's gaze for a long moment, his silence more powerful than any outburst. Finally, he replied, softly but firmly, "Because the world's already full of men who mistake fury for justice." Silence swallowed the room. The cameras caught every angle. Behind him, the still frame of his injured hand remained on the monitor, a quiet symbol of restraint in the face of cruelty. The inquiry continued for another hour, but the tone had changed. No longer did the senators treat Ezra as just a witness. He had become a benchmark, a man who hadn't just endured an incident but had turned it into a blueprint for change. By the end of the session, the room had shifted from questioning to acknowledgement. The final report, released a week later, included Ezra's findings as the foundation for sweeping reform. mandatory encrypted surveillance archives at all national transport hubs, third-party oversight bodies, and a complete audit of subcontractor security protocols. Varen's licenses were revoked. Several of its hidden subsidiaries were seized by the Department of Justice. A few key executives vanished from the public eye entirely. Yet, amid all the noise, Ezra refused interviews. He didn't issue public statements. He simply returned home. Alone in his apartment, he moved through silence like a man tending to a quiet forge. He stood by his window each morning, stretching the fingers that had once been fractured. The tendons still ached slightly in the cold, but the ache was familiar now, an echo of something he had learned to turn into discipline. One evening, as the light dimmed and the city skyline glowed faintly through the glass, he stood before a narrow table where documents from Argentum's new oversight division were laid out. His assistant, Jalen, entered the room quietly. "Final reports in," Jalen said. "They credited you for initiating the entire reform package. Third-party transparency is law. Now Ezra didn't look up." "Good," he said simply. Jalen hesitated before asking, "Do you ever regret not fighting back physically?" Ezra flexed his knuckles slowly, letting them stretch one by one before curling them back into a fist. The motion was controlled, deliberate. He looked up toward the city and said, "To rebuild something, you must first survive its breaking." Ezra stepped into the prison's visitation wing without hesitation. The room was sterile, its walls the same dull gray as the folding chairs bolted to the floor. A narrow table divided the space between visitor and inmate, and above them, a ceiling-mounted camera blinked red, recording every movement, every silence. He had declined the usual security escort, opting instead for quiet. Jalen had tried to talk him out of coming. "There's no gain in it," he had said. But Ezra wasn't here for gain. He was here because something unfinished still echoed in the silence that followed Conrad Vale's name. The door, on the far side, creaked open. Conrad shuffled in, thinner than Ezra remembered, his posture subdued. He wore a plain brown jumpsuit, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms once clenched in arrogance, now lined with quiet regret. His eyes met Ezra's briefly, then darted downward, unsure whether to sit or wait for instruction. A guard closed the door behind him without a word. The click of the lock was the only sound. Conrad sat, exhaling softly as though the act alone required permission. "Mr. Dane," he began, voice raspy. "I didn't think you'd actually come." Ezra didn't reply right away. He watched the man before him, measuring the sincerity in his posture, the tremble in his voice. The anger was gone, both from Conrad's face and from Ezra's own heart. What remained was weight, unspoken, unresolved. "I read the file," Ezra said calmly, folding his hands in front of him. His fingers, once shattered under Conrad's grip, flexed without pain. "Your completion of the program. Restorative justice, 21 weeks. You met the conditions." Conrad's hands tightened on his knees. "I know, it doesn't undo anything. What I did, it was more than abuse of power. It was—" He struggled for the word. "Cowardice, maybe. I let my frustration turn into cruelty." Ezra's gaze didn't shift. "Why did you request this meeting?" "To say I'm sorry." "In person. You already apologized," Ezra interrupted softly, voice low but firm. "When you admitted the truth." Conrad looked up slowly. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but something flickered behind them. Awareness. "They told me that would be enough," he said. "Plead guilty. Say the right things. Move on." "But I can't move on. Not from what I saw in your eyes that day." A faint hum came from the ceiling vent. Ezra leaned back in his chair, his body relaxed but his mind focused. "What did you see?" he asked. "I thought I was breaking you," Conrad said quietly. "But instead, you reset your own hand in front of a room full of people and walked out with your head higher than mine ever was. That's when I realized I didn't break anything. I exposed myself. Ezra's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but thought. Most people in your position hide behind protocol. You didn't even try. Why? Conrad hesitated. Because I thought power was how hard you could push. His voice cracked. I was trained to believe that. Trained to believe fear was authority. Ezra nodded once. His voice lowered into a register almost too calm. And I learned it's how calmly you can pull things back from collapse. A silence settled between them. Thick, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that weighed differently for each man. For Conrad, it was penance. For Ezra, it was the quiet that followed understanding. I've spent a year inside these walls, Conrad said after a long pause. They taught me the language of consequence. But you, he paused, gathering himself, you taught me the language of control, not domination. Control Ezra stood slowly. Control isn't what people think it is. It's not about winning. It's about not losing yourself. Conrad didn't rise. He stayed seated, watching as Ezra moved toward the exit. Before he reached the door, the prison warden stepped into the room. He was a tall man with a thick mustache and a clipboard tucked under his arm. Most men don't visit the ones who tried to hurt them, he said. Ezra looked at him briefly. I didn't come for closure. I came for continuity. The warden blinked, unsure how to respond. Ezra glanced back at Conrad one last time. You treat enemies like they're mirrors, the warden murmured. Ezra opened the door, his expression unreadable. Sometimes they are. The footage froze mid-frame. On the left, Conrad Vale, hand clenched like a vice around Ezra Dane's fingers, the tendons in his arm taut with cruelty. On the right, Ezra, blood trailing down his knuckles, eyes unblinking as he reset his own fractured joint without a sound. Behind the podium in Oslo's Grand Ethics Hall, Ezra stood unmoving as the images hovered silently on the screen. The auditorium, filled with world leaders, corporate executives, data policy architects, and investigative journalists, had gone utterly still. The sound of a single chair creaking echoed like thunder. Outside, snow slid gently past the tall windows, untouched by the intensity pulsing within the room. Ezra's voice, when it came, was steady, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Accountability, he said, isn't revenge dressed in paperwork. It's truth, structured to outlive anger. He let the words linger, not rushing them. His gaze moved across the room, not to impress, but to connect. Men from every corridor of power, governments, private security firms, academic think tanks, were watching a man who hadn't fought back with fists but had reshaped policy with restraint. When that moment happened, Ezra continued, gesturing toward the screen, when he bent my hand back and tried to break more than just bones, I had two choices: react or rebuild. He paused, letting the crowd digest that. In that moment, I learned that pain can either infect a man or instruct him. I chose instruction. The applause, when it came, was not thunderous. It was measured, reverent, the kind that acknowledged transformation, not triumph, the kind that belonged in cathedrals and courtrooms. As the session broke for intermission, Ezra stepped down from the stage. Several officials moved toward him with questions, but he gently waved them off, pointing toward the exit corridor. A dark-haired student in a worn charcoal coat hesitated by the stairs, clutching a notebook with trembling fingers. "Sir?" the young man asked, stepping forward. "How did you know what to do when everything was collapsing?" Ezra looked at him. The boy's eyes weren't seeking facts. They were pleading for something deeper, for assurance, for clarity in a world that rarely rewarded it. "I didn't," Ezra said. He waited, just long enough for the uncertainty to hang in the air. "But when you refuse chaos," he added, lowering his voice, "even your silence becomes a weapon." The student nodded slowly, eyes wide as if committing the words to memory. Ezra gave him a quiet nod and disappeared down the hallway, bodyguard free, briefcase in hand, shoulders squared. The hotel lobby was nearly empty by the time he returned. A fire crackled in a stone hearth near the corner, but he didn't stop. He moved past the front desk, up the elevator, and into a quiet suite overlooking the edge of Oslo's frozen skyline. Inside, silence greeted him. Not hollow, but serene. He removed his coat, laid his notes on the desk, and sat near the window. The glow of the city reflected faintly on the glass. Towering buildings below blinked with distant purpose, each one a monument to decisions made, systems built, and truths either spoken or hidden. Ezra extended his right hand and flexed each finger slowly. The movements were smooth now, no tremor, no swelling. Just precision, like the calibration of a well-forged instrument. That hand had once been the site of cruelty. Now it served as proof of control. He sat there for a while, breathing evenly, not needing anything from the world outside that window. He had said what needed to be said, not with rage, not with grandeur, but with structure and the clarity of one who refused to be undone. Outside, snow fell softly over Oslo, mirroring the calm within him. Some victories aren't loud, they're just irreversible. He shattered another man's hand and watched that same broken finger reset a fractured nose before the tables turned. If you believe real power doesn't need warning, subscribe now, because justice never comes softly. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, arrogance, and the abuse of authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, accountability, and the consequences of judging others without respect.